Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to a different continent with Raumlabor. The Raumlabor Collective was created in 1999, and today it includes 9 architects, landscape designers, and artists who live in Berlin. They have different educational backgrounds. The Berlin University, Bartlett School of Architecture, Royal Academy of Denmark, or Cooper Union in New York. But their common feature is experimentation. So the Global Award rewards here a collective which is at the forefront of the whole European participatory scene. To quote them, we fought to make sure space can be understood in a wider way at the crossroad of architecture, urbanism, art, and activism. Our understanding of space has led us to come up with skills, know-how, knowledge that enable us to use the loopholes of the current economic situation. We do an architecture without customers that finds its own market. Now, we sometimes say that the laureates of the Global Awards seek a pragmatic utopia, which is sought one. And if it's true, Raumlabor is completely entitled to be here. To quote them again, we understand the city as a place of diversity and contradiction between different interests, and this is why it is essential to know the possibilities of a practice which encourages the use of the city by a society as a whole. Experimental processes that we initiate must then be able to develop in a normal political and economic setting. If Bunsum Pritada is a master in brick, Raumlabor is a master in processes. They have developed co-programming, co-designing, and even co-producing processes. They even publish books that can be called books of urban and architectural processes, and they also are deeply concerned, deeply involved in transmission. They've created a university. The Open Raumlabor University was founded in 2015 in Berlin. Dear friends,
hi, thanks. Thanks for the nice introduction. We're happy to be here, and I think we're really honored to be part of this growing network of honorees of the Global Award of Sustainability. So thank you again. The title of our presentation is Agency of Urban Practice, and we've chosen I think it's 8 keywords as a way to describe urban practice by highlighting specific issues and sampling our projects into a bigger picture. So, Marilyn, you keep the watch? Yeah, we tend always to excite. Actually, I thought as we are 2, we have 80 minutes, right? Oh, no, okay. Okay, well, worth trying. Now I have to go back again. So, first a few words about our practice. Raumlabor itself emerged in a process driven by shared interests in spatial production. I think this is one of the most driving parts of our practice. And I think a common understanding of space based on the conviction that space is not defined by walls, but the product of social interaction, and a curiosity to find ways in more intermediate interaction with the urban environment. So I think our name itself could be understood as a mission statement that describes our approach to space as framed by making and research. As you can see here, it's not only us 2, Marcus and myself, but a bigger group of, at the moment, 9 architects. From the beginning, an informal, adaptable network structure proved to be a good framework to pursue our goals. I think still now we try to keep this framework for collaborations as informal as possible to maintain a certain fluidity shaped by ongoing projects and activities. So soft values become important within such an informal way of collaborations and organizing work. So thus, commitment and mutual trust are really significant currencies within Raumlabor. So if you look at the background of Raumlabor's emergence, the separation from content and business was created from the beginning and is mostly maintained today to keep a high level of flexibility and artistic freedom. At the same time, Raumlabor could be seen as a commons, and all group members are commoners, accumulating like symbolic capital. They could be given economic capital through new projects. So I think This helps us to bridge like the gap between idealism on one side and pragmatism on the other side. And I think it's key to understanding how our practice operates. So our interest in processes of spatial production led to an extended understanding of space at the edges of architecture, urbanism, art, and activism. So with urban practice, we create links between different fields and bypasses between different scales. So for example, by looking at an urban planning strategies with the eye of an artist, or by bringing artistic concepts in the context of architecture, or by creating spatial performances and performing spaces. Just hold on a second. This is us in 2010, when we had an exhibition of our work in the Kunsthaus in Bregenz in Austria. And I think it looks like a staged picture, like a programmatic picture. It was not staged, but it's quite nice to have Peter Zumthor's museum as a backdrop. Where we added a new entrance as an extension to public space on the left-hand side, which we named Raumlabor, and us performing as a group of artists, architects, whatever, and the man in the foreground performing everyday life by doing his errands. So I quite like this picture because it describes in a playful way some of our kind of issues. Like architects always try to plan and control things, and then always things happen and mess up your kind of plans, and you're trying to have control. And I think this is very important, crucial, why we're interested in kind of processes, and saying that processes then that they always have a kind of direction, a vector, and I think this is crucial, but you always have to stay open to kind of forces that come in. It's like sailing, yeah, the wind comes from here to there, and you want to have a direction, but you have to deal, you have to refer to these kind of resistances. Next. So the next term is public space, and I would say it has always been a main focus of our work and interest. And I think this is because public space is a societal mirror, and as such an indicator of the condition of a society. And I think public space reflects the changes in 1999, when the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think, was a trigger for a kind of globalized neoliberal capitalism. And I think this is also recognizable in public space. And with our practice, we try to change the perception of public space by stretching the limits of the given protocols. And for us, public space should really be a space for societal negotiations. But I think still it's a political space, and I think a space for protest, and I think this is maybe one of the key virtues of public space. And like you can see here, it's always a space for kind of tactical acting in time. And I think with this picture, which shows Occupy Wall Street, and I think it was a change of protest somehow, because I don't know if it was the first time, but one of the first times when public space was occupied. Not only kind of a demonstration, people passing and being there very ephemeral, but really staying for a longer time. And very often a protest comes along with a kind of significant symbol, like I think it was the tent for the Occupy Wall Street. And in Hong Kong, we had an umbrella. In Hamburg, we had I think what's a toilet brush as a kind of sign for protest. And in Turkey, I remember there was this kind of standing man as a kind of form of protest, because protests and demonstrations weren't allowed anymore. So I think it was a kind of subversive way to formulate the protest. And I think it's quite interesting to learn about all these kind of strategies and tactics, how we can behave in public space. And I think this is a very common feature for protests and turmoil, is kind of smoke, as you can see here. And we use this as a inspiration or kind of language. I think the smoke as a really ephemeral kind of thing, happening and going and dividing, being kind of really smoothly. We used for this piece we did in Tallinn, yeah, I don't know when, it was some years ago. In 2013, for the Biennale, we've invited as kind of artists. And I quote, "The smoke coming out from the monument space creates several levels of relations. It highlights a paradox of monuments, being very often representations of a cultural and historical perspective of the ruling powers. They become object of attack and removal when powers in society shift. I think this was quite obvious in Eastern Europe. I think after the end of the Cold War, all the kind of Lenins, they had to go away and be removed. I think this was a Lenin too. I don't know. Yeah, he was more involved in this. And I think in Eastern Europe, this is widely true for monuments like erected during the Cold War. And what we tried to do to restore, because I think this was empty at the moment when we did this project, we wanted to restore the urban setting, the historical urban setting that you can see in this kind of postcard with a Lenin in front of this ministry. And the time, to use the time gap between the former monument and the future monument, which was planned to be erected, I think, after the Biennale. And what I think it's quite nice, what we want to do is to address the here and the now, that why the whole thing, the plinth, was just a mock-up. And just built for a moment to exhaust smoke and then taken down again. And I think it created an unexpected setting in front of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I think the cloud, in this sense, really is a language that we wanted to create to highlight the moment in public space. And then what remained in the end was only a kind of a postcard, and I think this was the final goal, to create this postcard, to send it all over the world. And I think it reflects that acting in public space is always acting in time, and I think this is a kind of crucial frame. I think now it's your turn, coming with the next
situation. Okay. Yes. Situation. We're basically doing this lecture, this talk, as a collection of terms, situation is a very important term for our practice. For us, situation is a specific social and spatial moment that creates a particular atmosphere. With architecture, we build our futures. We work on prototypes for possible futures. And we do this by creating live situations. We transform places temporarily and induce frameworks for collective action. Acting is actually very important to us, and experience potential is better than a concept of a potential. I think that's kind of one of our fundamental beliefs. This experience is based on a project we did in Halle, and here on the photograph you see Halle is a city of two parts. In the very back you can see the old part, and in the front you see the new part. The new part was constructed during the time of the former GDR, and it's one of the 4 new founded cities of the GDR, which we were commissioned to work on in 2002, and that was actually one of our first commissions. It was very exciting to explore this city under the, let's say, paradigm of shrinkage, with the whole kind of economic turnaround in the situation. The former GDR, a lot of workplaces disappeared or were destroyed, and eventually the people didn't have anything to do there, didn't see their future in these cities, so they left. And a city that was originally planned and built for around 105,000 people was facing a decline to half of the population, with a lot of spaces left empty, and the whole questions around, like, what do we do with this big frame of a city that we're left with? We didn't look at the city only as a hardware. As you could see in the previous picture, you could see the city as a shell, in a way. But in fact, this was a very important representation for us. We called it the potential map, basically accumulated by walking through the streets, talking to lots of people, getting to know the people and their interests and their potentials and their engagements, and kind of collecting, non-prioritizing, spatial potentials, social potentials, potentials in people, to, in a way, find a starting point to turn around this narrative of loss and shrinkage as a drama, but rather find starting points for possible future developments. Yeah. And here are some of the micro situations that we encountered. That's a sort of day-to-day surface of the city. And even though it looks harsh, it still had around 40,000 people living there at the time. And it's a very, very real living environment for them. So what we came up with is this plan that we call Colorado Plan. Colorado because of the colors, really. Because we thought like, yeah, exactly. A mix of flavors and colors, basically promoting an idea of a local identity on a much smaller scale than the identity of the new town as a whole. And even at a smaller scale than the socialist Wohnkomplex, the housing complexes, I think basically a sub-order of the socialist order, more based on the local potentials that we found and suggesting that within these frames, they would probably be small enough to be actually negotiable and walk or develop towards a common future. Because, of course, with the capitalist order arriving in the former socialist city, ownership was distributed, and many of these buildings were kind of in a standstill because the owners went bankrupt and couldn't invest or couldn't, let's say, support the development. We used these observations also to develop diverse settings and tools to create situations as frame for social interaction, mostly based on common making, cooking, and eating. This is making chairs in the Biennale in Venice, and used in various places throughout the whole Giardini. And this is the kitchen monument, we call it. An inflatable, I would say, architectural tool to inhabit public spaces and turn them into a space for a common experience, for a common moment to share, for a common practice to cook and eat together, and for basically by doing that, inventing the question of what this space could be and what it could be good for if it's not, as you could see before, it's under a motorway. If it's not this, what we see in the first place, a sort of leftover space that we have no idea for. Or this, which is called Saale Onsen. It's basically a very, very fast-made temporary construction that turns a river shore into something like a public hot tub. Amazing. Next term, process. And thanks for introducing us with this term. I think it is a very important one in our work. And I would say even the city is nothing static or rigid, even though we see rigid forms around us. But we understand the city as something being in permanent transition and transformation. It's just a question of scale of time that we look at the city. And maybe the time that the city is changing is a little bit larger than our own time or the time that we somehow can really feel physically. So process and process design plays an important role in our work when we speak of open, adaptive, and incremental processes, considering the possibility to respond to changes as an essential feature in such processes. As Christoph was earlier hinting at the unexpected to happen, like this man appearing in the picture. So the concept of learning and collecting knowledge is important when thinking in processes as a frame for spatial negotiation. For us, the design of a process is a crucial element, especially in long-term urban transformation processes. And this example is, again, we were involved on an urban scale, commissioned by the city of Berlin, the Senate of Urban Development, to come up with a proposal to basically design a transition process for the airfield in Tempelhof, in the center of the city, into something like a public sphere, not really knowing what this sphere exactly should be like. We found space in abundance, and we also discovered that there is a time gap. At the time, Berlin didn't have let's say, the pressure of the market as we feel it today, but it was in a so-called relaxed market condition. So there seemed to be a lot of time available to find out what this space might want to be. And we developed a process that involved the inventiveness of the people of Berlin. At least I think that's what we were looking for. Not to master plan a transition and say these are the steps you have to take, but rather develop an open format for this place to somehow be used and experimented with. And through this use and experiment, sort of slowly find and co-create an idea of what the future of this place might really be. And also what the actors that should be involved in this process could be, beyond the usual actors from the political scene, from the development scene, and so on, from the economic side. We developed new tools like this that we called the, how did we call it? The dynamic master plan. Exactly. The dynamic master plan basically as a translation tool between, on one side, a planning department that was very keen to look at space represented through as a plan, and on the other side, the understanding that space is always in transition, so we need to somehow integrate the factor time. Of course, we also drew time diagrams that made us able to illustrate the parallel processes and how they might interact with each other. Here you can see the major process in the middle that was part of our conception is the activation through use, and how in the bottom something that we call public space is not just something that is there, but something that appears over time through these various activities, presences, and presentations. Another example is about this process idea, is from Sweden, and it's basically the one some of you maybe have already seen. It's an iconic piece, and I'm just very happy to place it in the process narrative here. Here we see the free harbor of Göteborg in Sweden, which is in these different shades of pink overlaid again by a master plan of a future redevelopment as a very densely built housing area, including a big green park. And our entrance in the process here was very, very early, basically in a condition where all these dreams or proposals were somehow still up in the air and the place looked like this. But I think very clever partners over there had already understood that it's important not to only plan and realize, but if this central piece of the city wants to be part of the city really, to go more procedural and to sort of open the process also to a public experience. And as part of that, Raumlabor was commissioned on this side to think about a program that was called Bathing Cultures as basically a way to connect neighborhoods, people from Göteborg to this very place, and to create through the experience of sitting in a bath or sharing a bath, open a space for negotiation for possible futures of this place. Yeah, and here we see Sam Carvalho holding the model of the then built sauna over the site. We thought it's super good to sit in a box that is sort of removed but very integrated in the site. And in the way we like to work is often to be on the site with the team and to work very, very one-to-one and precisely about work with details that really react on the local condition. And I thought this might look sort of over-detailed for some of you, but if you're there, the wind is very strong, the rain comes at horizontal. So basically, I think this level of detail really helps you to only exist in this kind of very harsh environment, where the sauna, as you can see it here behind the trees, is placed in a way as a Trojan horse, as an intermediator between a condition now, where it's rough and exposed and unbuilt, and the future where it's going to be full of architecture, full of people that are living there, and it's going to be more defined. So in a way, a sauna as a place to collectively imagine what this urban area could be, and to also open it up in a way for an experience and use.
Okay, my turn again. Real utopia, which is obviously a contradiction, referring on one side to the complexity of contemporary life and to the dilemmas related to it. So we're always kind of caught in this kind of two sides of the medal where you have to make decisions and can't do everything right. So we picked this as a central theme in our show that we did, we named by Utopia in the Kunsthaus in Bregenz, where we stated that there's nothing like a utopian vision today, a utopian vision for the future. It is more that the future is something you have to be afraid of, you have to fear, and there's really a desire for the good old days where everything seemed to be kind of simple, overlooking and easy. Whereas back in the 60s, the future was something colorful, full of aspiration, and that things would be better, and technology was something that really would improve our life. And today, I think this is really kind of a different view on the future. And with the disappearance of the welfare state, I think the positive attitude towards the future disappeared as well. And interesting is that the future of then is the today of now. And I think it's quite interesting because today, I mean, this is in Berlin where they rebuilt the castle in the very center. So we refer really to kind of pictures from I don't know, 100 years ago and say this is the future because we don't have any kind of idea what the future could look like. So with this dilemma, we kind of started to work on this show, and we thought we wanted to explore our own work in this sense. So what we did is to make this drawing that added a lot of our projects into a cityscape, and it proved that it doesn't create a bigger vision itself. So, but many islands of what we call otherness, and that's why we ended up with this idea of kind of real utopias. So what it means is that you have to accept that you can't solve all the problems of the contemporary society, and that you have to work within these kind of existing conditions and to find kind of small solutions on kind of site-specific scale. So the impact for us of this could be really nicely described with Archigram's Instant City, which describes a sleeping town, which is kind of approached by Zeppelin. It's kind of they called him a sleeping town, and then the Zeppelin arrives and all the activities descend. Then there's an event happening. There's a lot of activities going on. We have a highest density. And I think this is where it becomes interesting for us, because the moment of infiltration and start to create networks like that work on their own and take over the spaces. So I think very often we're asked why we do this kind of temporary projects, and I think one of the main goals is that we would come to a moment where things work on their own, because I mean, as an architect, you can, even if you think in processes and to build do constructions yourself, there's always a moment you have to leave and take yourself out. So, and looking, or based on the idea of real utopia, I want us to show some projects that were kind of existing for more or long time span. So this is Open House. Was developed as a vertical village in Anyang in South Korea, where we were invited as part of an artistic kind of festival, as kind of artists. And I think it's quite interesting. That's very often cultural money that we can use to create this kind of testing situation. It's not money from the planning departments or from other clients, so it's really kind of cultural money. And what the goal is to discuss the issues of community against the background of like rapid urban redevelopments. I don't know what's coming. Like this is like the condition where the site was. And with the open house, we wanted to construct a social sculpture as a unique form of collective space. I think it went on for like 6 years before it was taken down due to people I mean, it's really difficult to evaluate this from Berlin. Okay, thanks. Well, it says 13 here. Sorry. we can negotiate on this. But I think we had some serious phone calls, and we tried to encourage people that they really leave it there. But at some point, you always have to accept when it's over. Then I think it's better to take it down and create a new situation to a new future. Another project is in Italy. It's in Turin. It was like on the suburbs of Turin. We were invited by the Goethe Institute to activate a vacant supermarket. Actually, it never has been active, it never has been on. It was like from the beginning, it was a failure in a suburb. And the idea was to create a kind of local community center. For this project, we organized a different form of participation to find out about the problems and needs in this area, and to shape an appropriate program and design and build a space which really fit in their needs. And I think it's always important to create this kind of visibility that there's something new coming up. And in this process, I think it was really helpful that we could go back and forth. So we had kind of, I think, 3 workshops coming back yearly. So, and I think you can adapt and respond to the changes and needs. And I think this was really working for many, many years, but you depend on the people running it. So I think with like the people were like 17, 18 when they started to work with us. They becoming like 24, 27, they at some point leave and find other goals. This is the last project in this context. It's the Eichbaum Opera, the Oak Tree Opera House, was a place and a performance that we initiated ourselves, conceived and developed in 2006 for the Eichbaum metro station. And it was really developed around this temporary building we call the Opera Hut, like the building huts in the medieval times, so that come along with the process and make the space and be a kind of a social hub for people to meet. And you could see the site that the opera, or the station, was really placed in the middle of an intersection between a major road and a highway. And this is how it looks today. I think there was maybe in the 70s more a place of aspiration for a better future, and you can see it was conceived as a marketplace, but this is how it looked today. And the interesting thing that we used and we accepted the space as it was to some extent, and saying, in addition to the local people's stories, we invited the people to bring their stories as a kind of base for the librettos for the opera, and the noise of the highway around the site, the rhythm of the metro trains, the space of the station, or spatial condition of the station, become all formative parts of the opera. So the metro trains kept on running where the opera was performed. So the theatrical space and the space of the everyday life merged into a kind of performative setting.
Narrative.
10 minutes.
10 minutes ago. Good. Narrative, another term. I mean, real utopia is already a term that has something to do with a narrative, I would say. No, it's about entering the narration of the city. Could be different, or we could be co-creators, or we could be inspired by something like the archigram ideas. We believe that our cultural being together in the city works through a sophisticated way of retelling narratives. We constantly reproduce them in a way. The way we act, the way we use spaces, the way we interact between each other, in a way can be also seen as a narrative and a reproduction of a form. So it's very hard to, and very peculiar, to introduce new narratives and just say, you know, we're going to do everything very, very different. Because it needs a lot of people behind this narrative, and it needs conviction, I guess. Or it's also hard to shift existing narratives into an existing web. But it's happening every day. And while we were growing up, I think in a society that was very dominated by the welfare state fading, but still the narrative of equal opportunities for all in Germany was very, very strong, and that an education system should be shaped that everybody has the opportunity to go to university, not depending on what your parents are doing. We now saw a global shift after let's say, the duality of socialism and capitalism evaporating and the neoliberal paradigm taking over, that now performance and competition are at the first line and not equality and fairness. And on the other side, scarcity and austerity as the other terms of, like, the public pockets very often are empty, and the schools that the kids go to are really, really run down. So that just as an example of sort of narratives on the larger scale. And here we would like to look at narratives as a way to work on the construction of a common ground. So we still try to do that, no? Even though we know it's difficult. Connecting to existing narratives sometimes helps. Like here we're in Montreal looking at grain silos, the great industrial time, no? Or the Buckminster Fuller World Fair Pavilion, or infrastructures as bridges, motorways, and here the river. Somehow here in Montreal we got interested in this thing, which is a lot of water, and the connection, how our cities connect to water and how our lives connect to water. The St. Lawrence stream is just an enormous natural force passing by this city. And while, again, one of our narratives is to turn the tap off when we brush our teeth, and you know, ideally even under the shower when we use the soap, to really, really save and save and save water. Here it was obviously available in vast abundance. So I got curious to visit the waterworks, and this is one of 3 of the city of Montreal. And in a way, I was so fascinated by this enormous investment in the collective infrastructure that we all use every day by opening the tap and closing it. But we're really, like, probably not so aware that this infrastructure is an investment we inherited from a previous generation. Here you see this is where the water comes in from the St. Lawrence stream. And you see out of 6 openings, only 2 are working. So even though the system is super inefficient and is losing 40% of the water carried through, and here is the water pipe going into the city. It's somehow at the, you know, it's not even running at full speed in a way, and still it is there. It is this kind of hidden infrastructure in the back, which is very, very fundamental for the way we can use the city, and also how we can have a better life, I think, a good life. Interesting enough, also in Montreal, the city had a vote on, or a big discussion if the water should be taxed, and they decided to not tax it. So basically water is free, it's not charged by consumption, but paid through taxes. And the reason to this, the reason why they decided this way was because they said, if we charge for the water, the rich people can still fill their pools, but the poor people don't have access to it anymore. And this is a situation we don't want. So looking at taxes as a way to redistribute opportunities was for them much more apparent. And here is the project. The project is basically trying to create a place to appreciate this infrastructure. And it's called Fountain House. It's a round little thing where a tap is permanently running. A little, you know, you could call it a temple around a running tap, around the narrative of that you should not do, no, keep your water running. That arrived in the middle of the city, very, 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 very central in Montreal, next to Boulevard Sainte-Catherine, in a double layer facade. Here you see the outer skin, we call it the living skin. And inside this kind of more contemplative, very focused inner space where the water is dripping down, where every now and then some cloud appears, and that is really only constructed around the experience of having access to this water, being able to drink it, and use architecture to create an atmosphere of playfulness, of sensitivity, of somehow it's okay to be there. Also probably a certain moment of surprise, because you don't know what this place is good for. But as we can see here, if people sort of get through this moment of this is an interesting picture and start investing themselves in being inside the space, we thought that this is the way to open an imaginary for, wouldn't it be nice if our cities had other infrastructures, or if our infrastructures had also other ends than this very pragmatic tap at home, but also every now and then an end that is somehow spectacular, somehow comforting, somehow luxurious, but it's not based on the exchange of money against something, but really based on, let's say, the respect of our generation for this amazing infrastructure heritage that we got. And here we're inside and outside. So commoning could be one more term we look at. And I think I would just probably start hinting at that, because we're sort of getting towards the end of our time frame here. Commoning is a term that we discovered, that has been in the debate recently more and more, as a sort of third option between the private and the public that we've been growing up with so much. And commoning basically as an idea to organize around a resource as a community and manage and foster and support this resource and all benefit from this resource. And I think it's really interesting from an urban and architectural perspective to look at this concept and to what extent spaces or processes that we design can be looked at as a commons. And as Christoph said in the beginning, that we also discovered that maybe Raumlabor could be looked at as a commons, where the 9 commoners are somehow taking care of this collective immaterial thing that we all share and co-produce permanently. I think the example that I will probably not go in here is the urban school. But just to hint at, let's say, a possible extension of architecture beyond the object and beyond the situation as a built environment, the interest with the urban school was to, in the rural area, an area where former industrial area are now changing into something, to introduce or to look for models to create a conversation between people about this future. And to use the format of the school to say this conversation is open and everybody can take part by just subscribing to a class. And maybe I stop here because otherwise we go very much into detail with this example.
Well, what is the time saying?
Like 40.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, brush through, maybe you say some words to each.
Yeah. Well, we did trips, field trips, because we thought it's important to connect the local condition to an international condition and make sure through experience and creating meetings between tangible moments between people, that the crisis and the feeling of urgency is not something local and is not something that we're guilty for on a local level, but that it's really part of a larger phenomenon, and that people everywhere are somehow struggling or working on possibilities to develop this further, I would say. We also then shifted into a local program where we used ways to feedback the internationally collected knowledge, inhabited this little shop that you see here, and made sure that the class is not happening in an enclosed space, hidden away from society, but that it happens as much as possible, visible and accessible. Here you see the shop front, or it goes into the shopping center. Here we see Antoine from Bella Stock making an analysis of how the architecture could be reused, or inhabit in possible places like the top of a parking garage, really using different formats to interact, like a collective dinner as a setting for a lecture, or temporary structures, workshops, where an older lady for the first time was using a power drill, and we got very excited. And as a last, this is what I really like. We called it as-if installation, because we know there's always this big struggle about, do we get a permit, and can we allow this to happen, and do we really want it? And a breakthrough to have this, which is a hot bench heated with real fire in a pedestrian zone in the center of the city, was to say, okay, we have it for one day, and then it disappears again, and then the city can discuss if it wants to have it or not. And with this sort of public testing, we actually managed to have it up once, and now the city had took sort of 1.5 years to rethink it and make the process, and now it's coming again. So this idea of commoning, I think, was probably illustrated with the school as a sphere for, oops, we're going, here, this is what I wanted. As a sphere where also unexpected things can happen, and probably that's where the architecture or the inventiveness or the joy of creating spaces from us, again, also comes in, not only in programming and asking the questions, but also in really taking care that the spatial settings, the social settings, have a good feeling about them, and then it's a nice thing to discuss the city. Thank you.